Hey, Steve Deace here, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about the importance of religious freedom. You know, the United States has been the longest attempted human experiment in freedom and individual government ever attempted in the history of our species. It's the longest standing success story, and we're a country that's only into our 240s, which is not old when you look at the long arc of human history. And I think that shows you a couple of things. Number one, I think it speaks to the fact we're an exceptional nation. More on that in a moment. Number two, though, it speaks to how dang hard this thing called freedom, or better yet, liberty, self-government, how hard this is for us to pull off. Because human nature is not basically good. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all need repentance and redemption. So that's kind of a paradox, isn't it? How do you give people that aren't basically good the freedom and trust them with the freedom to chart their own course, blaze their own trail, make their own decisions, govern themselves? How do you do that? As Ben Franklin once famously said, according to legend anyway, after the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman on the street, hey, what kind of government did you all give us in there? And he said, hey, a republic, with this disclaimer. He said, a republic if you can keep it. So how do you walk this paradox? Well, there's a missing link to the formula here. Because while we are individually free, we are made so because of the image of whom we're made in. See, we can't keep that republic thing, as Ben Franklin warned, without fulfilling the observation that John Adams made, that this Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. Meaning a people that recognized that there was an authority higher than themselves, both the governed and the government, because they're both made up of people. They recognized there was an authority higher than themselves, an authority that needed to be acknowledged, and that if they acknowledged this collectively as a people, then they could keep a republic. They could maintain this Constitution. And that authority is God. What we did here with the United States is we kind of cracked the code. We came up with the idea that really wasn't our own. It was more of an observation. It was, to quote a phrase from our founding fathers, self-evident truth. That there is a God. Our rights come from Him. And that, therefore, the primary, maybe even only role of government is the protection and preservation of those God-given rights. And that when we violate that natural law as a people, we're individually accountable to that God. And when people in government, when they violate their oaths or they commit those sorts of infractions, they're accountable to that God as well. But we couldn't actually put that creed. Now, Chesterton once said that America was the only country ever founded on a creed. What was the creed? What I just said. There is a God, our rights come from Him, and government's primary, maybe even only role is the protection and preservation of those God-given rights. But we can't put that into practice without religious freedom. It's your first freedom. It's your most important one. Why? We're going to have a very difficult time holding on to a country founded on the notion of God-given rights if you don't have free and fair access to God. If you're not free to acknowledge Him, if you're not free to obey Him, if someone can walk into your business and say, hey, I want you to put a message on your craftsmanship, on your intellectual property, on your proprietary skills, I want you to use your platform to defy your God. And if you don't, I'll take your platform away from you. That's the most basic freedom of them all, other than life. If we're not free to acknowledge the author and giver of life, we're not free. There's a reason every totalitarian country in the history of the scriptures has sought to get rid of the Bible, because they recognized that it revealed to humanity there's an authority higher than government. And, authoritarians don't like recognizing such authorities. There's a reason why when the old Cold War iron block opened up in the late 80s, early 90s, and when the missionaries showed up, the people there kissed those Bibles because they weren't permitted to get their hands on them for decades. It was verboten because it preached a message that challenged the supremacy of the state. See, every government in the history of humanity has been a theocracy, every single one. It's just a matter of who the theo is. As Chesterton also said, when the government removes the God, the government becomes the God. And so it's no coincidence that you have seen a symbiotic relationship between the incursion of government and the imposition of government into you and I's conscience at the same time that we become a more secular people. The less we recognize, the less we obey and honor God, the less interested we are in doing what he says. And then the less tolerant we become of those who still are willing to do what he says. And this is the intersection we're at today. If you lose your right to religious freedom, now you can't practice human sacrifice and say, hey, that's my religion. You can't use your God-given rights to impose on somebody else's God-given rights. And human sacrifice obviously does that because it's an act of murder. That's not what we're talking about. But there should be no place for government to step in while you're exercising your God-given rights in a way that doesn't impose on somebody else's God-given rights. Somebody else does have a God-given right to life, so you don't get to practice, apocalypto human sacrifice. But somebody doesn't have a God-given right to impose their conscience on you to make you do that which God says is wrong. So no, they can't walk into your bakery and your floral shop and say, hey, we want this message communicated with your platform. They can't do that. Well, at least they're not supposed to be able to do that. But if we lose religious freedom, which is being threatened in unprecedented ways right now, then we're going to have to fight out the same argument and fight believers have had all throughout history. Kaiser curious or Christos curious? Is Caesar God? Is Caesar Lord or is Jesus Lord? Is God God or is the government God? That's the battle. That's why they come after our religious freedom. That's why the authoritarians cannot tolerate your rights of conscience. Because they understand that granting you that right is an implicit, maybe even an explicit recognition that they're not the ultimate authority here. This is what the Obama administration's actions against nuns a decade ago, that's what those were about. Hey, Obamacare says you have to pay for other people's birth control, or worse yet, other people using abortion as birth control. You have to pay for murder as birth control. So here's this order of nuns, 1,000 years old, that took a vow of chastity as well as poverty. You now have to disobey that millennia-old tradition. You have to disobey it in order to obey Barack Obama. And they were right to defy it. And luckily, they won in court. But the time is coming and may soon be here that we won't win such battles in court any longer. And in those moments, we're going to have to be willing and able to do what the generations who founded and framed our way of life were willing to do. Pledge our lives, fortunes, and sacred honors that we will not comply with ungodly and unlawful and unconstitutional edicts. That this Constitution protects me from the likes of you. And I will obey it and not you. I will obey God and not man. Now, that's a place, that's a dark place for us to go as a culture, but I think we're only one step away from that. And the one step away is the loss of religious freedom. This is the fight you fight so that you don't have to fight, if you know what I'm saying. Because if you lose this, if the state believes that it can impose on you, if the state believes that it's empowered to stand between you and your God, then it will believe that it can stand between you and anything else at the exact same time. Lose access to your freedom of religion, and you lose your God-given rights. Lose your God-given rights, and you lose your liberty. Lose your liberty, and this is a republic we can't keep. See, that's what's different between us. That's why we've had one constitution, while the French have had how many? In roughly the same amount of time. We acknowledged a truth that no other nation on earth ever has, and hasn't yet, that our rights come from God alone, not from the state, but from God. Lose that ideal, lose that creed, and you lose America. And the principle, the freedom that stands in the way of that maintains this thing we call American exceptionalism, is the freedom of religion. It's the fight we have to fight so that we don't have to fight. John 3:17.